It is sometimes claimed that Christianity is unique among world religions in the fact that it depends upon historical miracle claims of God acting in history. I think that's an overstatement. I mean, other world religions like Mormonism or Islam to various degrees depend upon miracle claims and historical events as part of the evidential base that grounds those religions. Of course, Judaism does as well to some degree. But I would say that Christianity is certainly perhaps the most well known in that it depends so centrally upon a single miracle claim that Jesus died and then bodily rose from the dead and was seen by his disciples. As Paul famously said in 1 Corinthians 15:14, if Christ has not been raised, our faith is in vain. So this raises that question then, what would happen if hypothetically the bones of Jesus were to be discovered, we were to have evidence that in fact Jesus was not raised from the dead, very strong evidence, what would that do to the truthfulness of Christianity and particularly to the religious experiences that Christians have appealed to as part of the narrative framework that justifies or provides a warrant for their belief system? Would the discovery of the bones of Jesus completely undercut everything? Or could Christianity, in some sense, or Christian religious experience, in some sense, survive the discovery of the bones of Jesus? This question was recently posed by Alex O'Connor to William Lane Craig. I want to take a look at that clip and then we can offer some comments coming out of that.
If the bones of Jesus were discovered, for instance, to give a famous example,
Mhm.
this would be the kind of thing, or I should form it as a question, would this be the kind of thing that would essentially just invalidate all of the religious experience that you may have had in your life, that you say sort of exists in a different evidential plane? But surely, upon discovering the bones of Jesus, proving that he never rose from the dead and ascended into heaven, this would give you reason to essentially favor this evidence over the personal experience that you've had with God, such that that personal experience becomes invalidated?
If the bones of Jesus were actually discovered, then the resurrection would be false and you should not believe in it. But I think that given um, the uncertainty inherent in archaeological discoveries, we're never going to have evidence that the actual bones of Jesus were found. I think the possibility would always be there.
Okay, so I think that Craig here is really missing the boat. What Alex O'Connor is asking is if you find the bones of Jesus, hypothetically, counterfactually, thought experiment here. If you were to find the bones of Jesus, or just generally overwhelming evidence, very strong historical evidence that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, would that invalidate Christian religious experience? Craig ignores that question, to be honest, or sidesteps it. And instead, he responds to a different question. The question he responds to is if you were to find the bones of Jesus, should you continue to believe Jesus rose from the dead? And Craig responds to that question by saying, no, but it's unlikely that we'll ever find the bones of Jesus. But that wasn't the question. The question was, if you were to find the bones of Jesus, could you, or sorry, would that invalidate all of your Christian religious experience? That's the question, and it's an interesting and important question. Craig goes on in the rest of the clip for about another 50 seconds or so to say that there have been times in history where Christians are presented with counter evidence to their beliefs in the historical resurrection of Jesus, and they may sense the evidence maybe even seems I'm this is my words now, but the evidence seems very strong against, perhaps even overwhelming against their current beliefs that Jesus rose from the dead or some other aspect of Christian belief. And then Craig just asserts, but I think that even in those times they are rational to continue to believe in Christian truth claims, Christian doctrinal claims. I do wonder to what degree someone like a Mormon could appropriate this same framework where Craig seems to treat warrant or justification for Christian truth claims not as prima facie. In other words, we are warranted in believing these things absent strong counterfactual evidence for their falsehood, versus believing Christian doctrinal truth claims as ultima facie, in other words, sufficient that they can defeat any counter evidence for them, and you could rationally continue to believe in them even if there is this very seemingly strong evidence for them or against them. And he seems here to be very much lean toward the ultima facie view, and I've seen that before in Craig's writing on these topics. That while Craig is often called very rationalist in his approach to Christian doctrine and apologetics and theology, nonetheless, there is this irrational or supra-rational, might be a more charitable way to put it, thing where he's not willing to concede that there could be this very strong evidence that could overwhelm a Christian's rational justification for continuing to believe in Christianity. The problem is that he never explains here the source, in this clip at least, the source of that ultima facie justification. Is it religious experience ultimately that Craig is appealing to here as that thing which can overwhelm any counter evidence, including evidence for the bones of Jesus, hypothetically speaking? And that, of course, brings us back to the very question that Alex O'Connor was asking in the beginning. Would the bones of Jesus undercut Christian religious experience? Craig doesn't answer that question, and it's an important and interesting question. So I've talked about this in different places. I have a chapter on this in my book, You're Not as Crazy as I Think, and I return to it in my book, Progressive Christians Love Jesus Too, where I talk at some length, for example, about Marcus Borg, who professed to be a Christian, but who didn't believe Jesus had bodily been raised from the dead. And there have been many professing Christians throughout history, particularly in the post-Enlightenment period, who have felt what Craig refers to in his video clip here. Again, the part I didn't show, where Craig talks about there are people in history who find themselves uh, facing overwhelming seeming evidence against their views. What do they do? Now, where Craig says, well, they should persist in those views, there have been many like Marcus Borg, who, in fact, Rudolf Bultmann would be another famous example, who adopted a different view of the meaning of Christian doctrine. So, for example, rather than think Jesus bodily rose from the dead, they may come to think if there's overwhelming evidence for whatever reason that Jesus didn't bodily rise from the dead, maybe we should, in fact, now think of the resurrection as God's people being his body that quote unquote rose from the dead in virtue of the birth and genesis of the Christian community itself, being a testifying miracle to the truth of Christianity. So you don't need to have the historical bodily resurrection of Jesus. What you need is the historical resurrection of the body of his people in the first century who've now gone out to proclaim his kingdom. Others like Albert Schweitzer have as well found themselves kind of in that space, wrestling with what it means to be a Christian, even though you are questioning the central miracle of Christianity. And I'll just say that I have sympathy for those people. I don't think the only option for them is the option Craig gives, that you persist in believing in the historical bodily resurrection of Jesus, because many of them just don't. But they do have this religious experience, as Marcus Borg did, or as Albert Schweitzer did. They have this impulse and ethical call to go out and bring healing to the world, as he did as a missionary doctor. And I think those people can live in the space of what, for lack of a better term, you can call a liberal Christianity, in which they may find themselves on the margins, have not sure what to think about the historical resurrection of Jesus, but nonetheless wanting to love God, wanting to love their neighbor, still having religious experience they cannot deny, and wanting to find a space for that, even though they find that they cannot accept the historical resurrection, bodily resurrection of Jesus. I had some years ago when I was a seminary professor, I had a student like this, a student who came to me in seminary and said, I'm trying to believe in the historical resurrection of Jesus, and for some reason I can't. My advice to them wasn't, you don't belong in seminary, you need to leave now. My advice was them to stay on the journey and to continue to love God and love their neighbor to the best of their capacity and look for God in their religious experience, in their participation in community, and then to allow God to journey with them and help them to work out their own doubts and questions and skepticism. Something broadly like that would be my advice here for anybody who, as well, doubted the historical resurrection of Jesus. It brings me back, actually, to my book, The Doubter's Creed, which I wrote in part for people like this who want to be a Christian but find themselves fundamentally doubting something. They may think there is evidence counter to Christianity, which is the equivalent of discovering the bones of Jesus. To them, I want to say, participate in the community to the degree that you can. And let's start with the love of neighbor, for example. The idea that every human being is of inestimable value, as a Christian would say in the Judeo Christian tradition, created in the image of God. And we are called to love them as we love ourselves. Jesus, when he talked about the life of faith, he didn't talk himself about the historical resurrection of Jesus. He didn't talk about the doctrine of the Trinity. He didn't talk about the doctrine of substitutionary atonement. Not to say that those doctrines don't matter, but to say that what he did talk about, what is at the beating heart, the center of Christian faith, what we call Christian faith, is love of God and love of neighbor. And if you are questioning some aspect of the bigger story, start with love of neighbor. That's half of all that we're called in the very heart of Christian believe and to do is to love your neighbor as yourself. And if you can do that, you're already well on the journey. And then you can continue to process your religious experience, your participation in community, and all these other things, along with whatever questions and doubts you have that are the equivalent of discovering the bones of Jesus. So that's my response to Alex O'Connor's question. I think it's a little more fulsome and direct as a response than Craig's, because Craig's just doesn't address the question that was posed in the first place. In fact, it deflects from it.